Yes, good morning, everybody. It's really a great pleasure and a real honor to be with you today. I've been with CITAC since 1994 with my first annual conference in Brussels, and then after that in many different places in the world. But this is the first time ever that I'm invited to give the keynote speech during the opening ceremony. What an honor, but what a pressure. Anyway, I'm very happy to be with you today, even if it's through the window of my computer. A strange situation and a bit sad, but I hope it will be over soon. Strange because I cannot see you. I have no idea of how many people are listening to me today. So I cannot really interact. Now the good news with that is that if you decide to disconnect, I will not get offended. But I hope you will stay until the end. And please use the chat to ask your questions. We will have time at the end to try to answer them. So today I'm going to give you some perspective on why and how to create a low carbon economy. Of course, we need to do more than just that. We must create a more sustainable world where 10 billion of people can live a prosperous and enjoyable life within planetary boundaries. We need to produce more food to feed this growing population, starting with those that are still starving today. We need more energy to provide the quality of life that everyone on this planet deserves. Still, more than 800 million of people do not have access to electricity at home. We need to restore the quality of a freshwater system. We need to reduce pollutions and create a toxic-free environment. We need to tackle plastic pollutions. And of course, we need to restore biodiversity and preserve ecosystem because we need healthy ecosystem to provide the food, the water, the air that we need. And foremost, we need to create a more fair and inclusive society. So, this is a long list of we need. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And you, me as a scientist, we have certainly a great role to play. My personal belief is that science and scientists need to be back at the table and take the lead to show the path. So today, I'm going to focus on one of the biggest challenges we are facing today, eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. The science is clear. To limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, we must cut global emissions by 45% by 2030. Commitments from countries and companies to be net zero by 2050 are multiplying from all over the world, and that's great. 2 weeks ago, 40 countries participated in the Leaders Summit on Climate organized by the US after they joined back the Paris Agreement. Basically, during 2 days, the world leaders have raced to make the biggest contribution to greenhouse gas reductions. The UK made the biggest pledge with new laws to deliver 78% reductions. The EU announced 55, the US 50, Japan, Canada also between 40 and 50. More than 1,500 companies have committed to net zero by mid-centuries, and about 11,000 cities have done the same. So I cannot cite all the commitment here because they are numerous. And we certainly need to celebrate that because this is exactly what we need. Today I'm not going to comment on the various interpretations from government and companies about the net zero definitions or which reference year they have used to make their commitment because we have to stay positive. This Leaders Summit probably will have a huge impact in the year to come. But let's face it, the task is huge. The good news is that we have a number of solutions that we can implement. So today, I want to share with you few observations, facts, that I think should be taken into account and addressed when designing these new energy transitions. I say few because this is a usually complex subject and it will require hours to cover all. All the data that I'm going to share with you have been extracted from official reports, UN, OECD, International Energy Agency, and scientific publications. Many charts have been redrawn from Our World in Data, a website owned by the NGO Global Change Data that published data from the Oxford University. I also use these data to do some back-of-the-envelope calculations to put things in perspective. The absolute number could be challenged, but I think the trend is correct. So, in my presentations, I will go quickly through the history of energy consumptions, how much we consume in the past, and from what kind of source, what's today's situations, and why we need to find new source of energy. Then I will go through some solutions, highlighting some important conflicting issues. So my goal is to give you food for thought, because we all need to get engaged in this subject to ensure that we are doing it right. The first grand energy transition started with the discovery and the use of fire. So basically, during 11,600 generations, taking 25 years for generations, this was the only source of energy that we were using. Burning wood, straw, and animal dry dung. All 100% renewable, all 100% solar-based. So basically, during 2,900 centuries, we have been doing exactly the same thing. No change, no innovations, at least as far as the type of energy is concerned. Same life, perfectly in line with planetary boundaries. So then the second grand energy transition started. So minus 10,000 years until quite recently, so basically the end of the 17th centuries, we started to use new sources of energy. Wind to move boat or windmill, water also to move windmill, charcoal made from wood, and then we started to use animals to carry and move objects. And that lasted 500 generations. Global energy started to increase steadily as population grew. It was again 100% renewable. Then came the third energy transitions. It all started back in 1770 when James Watt invented the first industrial steam. A bit later came the first combustion engine using fossil fuel. Then new sources of energy came and were used massively. So basically it took 8 generations to completely and irreversibly change the face of the planet. So you remember, we started with 11,000 generations. We were using very little energy. Then during 500 generations, we started to increase the use of energy. And then suddenly everything blew up. So basically, during my lifetime, I've been in contact with my grandparents who were living in a world with still the majority of the energy coming from biomass. The total world energy consumption at that time was about 5,000 terawatt for 1.5 billion of people. 5,000 terawatt is the energy consumed today in the EU from 28,000 people. So that gives you the size of the transformations. Then the use of coal and oil became dominant during the life of my grandparents. Hydro also started to play a role. My parents saw the explosion of gas. Then I came in 1961. Although I do not want to take full responsibility for that, but consumption started to explode everywhere, with new energy like nuclear playing an important role. Then my children came, then my grandchildren, with again more and more energy in the world. Now, I hope that they will be able to witness these 4th grand energy transitions that we need to implement. So basically, in about 6 generations, energy consumption has been multiplied by 14. From 5,000 terawatt, we are now consuming 171,000 terawatt. And more than 80% of this global energy is coming from burning fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas. This is huge. And the issue with big numbers is that it's always hard to figure out how big they are. At least that's the case for me. By the way, tera is 10 to the power 12. So basically you need to add 12 zeros after the number that I'm showing to you. And if it can help you to visualize better the size of the energy or the mass that we are using, 171,000 is the equivalent of more than 14,000 million tons of crude oil. And that is the equivalent of 73 tankers, 425 meters long, 63 meters large, delivery oil to the world every single day. So every single day we are using the equivalent, of course it's an equivalent, of 73 tankers full of crude oil. Now if we split that by countries, basically for China it means 15 tankers, for the US it's about 11 tankers, and for the EU it's about 10 tankers every single day. Now, as you know, there are huge discrepancies in the world in terms of energy consumptions. And for example, Nepal is using only 0.02 tankers per day. And for what? Why are you using so much energy? Well, for the quality or type of life, depending on how you want to describe it, that we have in the rich part of the world. To produce all the goods we have at home, from the toaster to TV, smartphone, washing machine, clothes, bicycle, books, food, of course. But also to build cities, houses, cinemas, school, hospital, roads, everything that you can imagine. Basically, there is energy behind every single thing that we do every day. And today, by using Zoom, we are also using quite a lot of energy. So this indeed huge amount of energy used in the world, it's today mainly from the developed world. Sorry. Now, the big issue with this type of level of energy consumptions, based on the energy mix that we have been using so far, is that every time we burn coal, gas, and oil, we emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a huge quantity. And we have been doing that for more than 200 years, every single day more. In 2019, more than 36 billion tons or gigaton have been emitted in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuel. If we include all the greenhouse gas emissions, so methane, nitrous oxide, fluorinated gas, and more, it is more than 51 billion tons or gigaton that have been emitted. As you can see on this chart, most of these emissions came from the developed world, starting with the UK and the industrial revolutions back in the 19th centuries. You can see also that some continents, like Africa, have contributed very little. This is what you can also see on the graph expressed by capita. Basically, the white space here is when data are missing, but probably emissions are very, very low. You can also see that by capita emissions are also not so high now for China, because still there's a lot of people in China that do not have access to a lot of energy. So the big issue is really to get rid of these greenhouse gas emissions. They are everywhere in what we do today. So I know this chart it may be difficult to read, but basically it shows you where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming, and they are coming from every single activity that we are doing. If you buy organic food, you are also emitting greenhouse gas. If you buy fair trade or local, you are also emitting gas. So we need absolutely big breakthrough changes to be able to do that. So what can we do? The first things that come to mind when we see this kind of data is to use less energy, less stuff. So this approach makes perfect sense, at least for those that today are over-consuming. The sad reality is that the world will not stop its appetite for goods and for energy. The simple reason being that today 50% of the CO2 emissions are generated from only 10% of the world population. So about 700 million. So basically all people living in Europe, in the US, and in the rich country. And the poorest 50% of the world, so about 3.5 billions, with less than $10 a day, are only responsible for 10% of the emissions. And these people deserve better quality of life, more and better food, better water supply and sanitations, better education and health services, more of everything, and therefore more energy. And more energy in today's situation means more CO2 emissions. Hopefully, in the year to come, the income of the poorest will increase. But more income also means better food. And usually better food means more meat. And as you know, meat production has a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions. We also often think that to tackle the climate crisis, we should just drive less, stop taking the plane. Well, let's look at that. In 2020, the COVID-19 crisis has put down the world economy. We stopped using our car, planes stay on the ground, and we all were locked down in the house. The pandemic had an impact on almost every aspect of how energy is produced, supplied, and consumed around the world. As a result, the energy-related CO2 dropped by about 2 billion tons, or 2 gigatons, which is the equivalent of 2/3 of the European Union emissions. That's a big number in absolute terms, but actually it represents only 5.8% of the global CO2 emissions in 2019. So that's important to understand, the world economy has been put down for a year, and we only got 5.8% reductions. So that gives you an idea of the size of the transformation that is ahead of us, if we want to get to 50% by 2030 in 10 years. So if you start doubting that we will make it, let me add two other disturbing facts. The first one is that this 5.8% decrease in CO2 are not going to contribute very long. All the post-pandemic analysis predict a rapid recovery of economic activities with a rebounding effect on CO2 emissions. So if we are back to normal mid-2021, greenhouse gas emissions are expected to return to previous level or even higher. The second one is that while all roadmaps to net zero are projecting the phase out of all fossil fuel by 2050, the projection from official agencies show that oil, coal and gas may remain at almost the same level in our energy mix for the next decade. So this means that all newly added renewable energy that we are going to put in place may not be used to phase out fossil fuel, but to deliver additional energy that we need. But let's stay optimistic. We have solutions and we can change that. For 200 years, we took advantage of a highly concentrated source of energy, easy to extract, to transport and use, and incredibly cheap. But the consequences for the planet are devastating. So our challenge now is to unfold in 30 years what we have been doing in 200 years. So the fourth grand energy transition that started, let's say, the last decade or the last few years, need to achieve two things. Deliver the energy that we need without emitting any longer greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere, and then remove as much as possible CO2 that is already in the atmosphere. We need to do it keeping in mind that total energy demand and associated raw material consumptions is expected to double by 2050. So I've put here 4 pillars of actions, and there's more, of course, that we can do, but let's just keep it simple. So solution exists. The first one is to reduce as much as possible CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions already in the atmosphere. And for that, we need to phase out fossil fuel. Now, we have seen that this may take longer than we think. A second solution is indeed to implement carbon capture and utilization and storage. This is a technology that consists at capturing the CO2 end of the pipe, so basically before it goes into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, this technology today the use of this technology is giving only 0.1% of the emission reduction that we need. And it's very expensive, about $100 per ton. But new innovations may change that. Actually, we need absolutely these innovations, because if we are not able to phase out as fast as we want the fossil fuel, let's at least making sure that we capture the CO2 before it goes in the atmosphere. Then the biggest opportunity comes from increasing efficiency, basically avoiding wasting energy. It has been estimated that this measure alone, okay, I have a problem with my, sorry. So it has been estimated that this measure alone can give us, about 37 of energy reductions. Now, another sad reality is that most of the time that we have increased efficiency and our use of energy has been more and more efficient during the last centuries, this has not translated in less emissions. Why that? Well, a British economist, William Stanley Jevon, has demonstrated that all gain in energy efficiency were basically cancelled by the fact that people, as a result of this gain, were consuming more or were doing more. Basically, it's more efficient, so I can use more. Cars consume less than 20 years ago, so I can drive more. TV are much more energy efficiency, so I can have a TV in all my room. Or now I spend less money heating my house thanks to my heat pump, then I can use this money to travel. So indeed, it's not working. So the second category of actions, it's indeed investing massively in low carbon technology. And of course, wind and solar have a huge role to play, as well as green, hydrogen and ammonia. But we also need to maintain nuclear. And I know at this right moment, by adding nuclear to the list, I may be upsetting some of you. So please, bear with me. I'm not advocating one particular energy, but I want to share with you a number of observations that I think we should take into account when debating, and more importantly, when taking decisions regarding on how to get to net zero. Now, let's look at some data to better understand what's ahead of us. So, first task is to phase out fossil fuel. In this chart, you can see the global energy mix in 2019. As I said before, 84% come from fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas. All the low carbon energy sources come today from about 15%. So basically, despite all the investment and commitment to move to renewable energy, they count only for 3.3% of the total energy consumption. So there's still a long way to go, knowing that the total energy is going to double in the coming decades. If now we look at the way that electricity is produced, the figures are better. So the low carbon energy source now account for 36%, with 26% coming from renewable. The goal in most of the roadmap is indeed to produce all the electricity from renewable, or at least from low carbon source. Now, when designing this energy transition, so phasing out all this fossil fuel that you see on the graph, there is a number of considerations that needs to be taken into account, that we need to be aware of. And this is what I'm going to share with you now. So only few considerations. So the first one is the quantity of energy that you can extract by square meter, because you need space to produce energy. And on this graph, you can see from different sources of energy, the quantity of watt that you can get per square meter. And you can see that fossil fuel have indeed the highest power density. And it's not for no reasons that this source of energy has been so popular. Highly concentrated, relatively easy to extract, to transport, and to use. Comparatively, renewable energy has a very low density. They are what we call diffuse. They may be everywhere, accessible to all, but they are not concentrated at all. So to put things in perspective, I've used two illustrations from Václav Smil, one of the world leaders in energy, that show how much power is required by square meter for highly dense residential building area when all people need to eat, cook, and cool at the same time. So basically 3,000 watts per square meter. Or what it takes in the middle of a traffic jam. 1,000, oh, there's a mistake here, so it's 1,000 watts by square meter. At least for the last one, it's an easy fix. If we all go by bike or public transportations, we can reduce that. But you can see the quantity of energy that is needed compared to what each source of energy can provide by square meter. Now, put that also in a different way. This represents the surface needed for 1 gigawatt of power. When you know that in a situation of a growing populations, we expect 2 to 3 billion people more by 2050, more land may be needed to produce food, to build city, to grow forest, to store carbon. So we are already short in space, and we must look at this very carefully. So I'm not suggesting that we should not use, for example, biomass, but if we do, we need to understand the consequences and what it takes. Now, another consideration is capacity factor. The capacity factor is a ratio between the electricity generated during a certain period of time over the initial power capacity. Put it simply, a capacity factor close to 100% means that you can produce electricity whenever you want. A low capacity factor means that you can produce electricity only during a limited period of time. Here I have used the highest number that I could find on the capacity factor. The reason why these numbers are different between sources are due to all kinds of reasons. For nuclear, it can provide its capacity all year long, basically except when you have maintenance. For gas, it could be for maintenance, but also because of supply issue or decision to stop production because of price considerations. For solar and wind, it may be due because it's just due because there is no wind and no sun anymore. And this makes this energy what we call intermittent. They only produce energy when there is wind and sun. Of course, another consideration to take into account is the CO2 emission that each of these technology emit. And again, here I have used full life cycle emissions, so including raw material extractions, building, use, and end of the life, including decommissioning for nuclear. And it's not a surprise that indeed fossil fuel have the highest emissions per kilowatt produced. And of course, renewable energy sources have the lowest emission of CO2, as nuclear, by the way. Only few tons per gigawatt produced compared to fossil fuel that have hundreds of tons. Now, raw material intensity is also a key consideration that we need to take into account. When you know that in the next 40 years, a city of the size of New York will have to be built every single month, you can imagine the quantity of concrete, sand, steel, and glass that this is going to require. Well, behind every energy source, there's also concrete, steel, glass, and all kinds of materials. And I'm sure you are going to be surprised by the figure that you are going to see now. So basically, this figure shows you for each type of energy that we have, the total quantity in tons per terawatt produced of concrete in blue, steel in orange, and glass. And I'm sure that you are surprised to see how much material that is required for wind and solar. But actually, that's the case today. This energy, they still require infrastructure to be able to provide what we need. So that's a very important factor to take into account when you want to design these energy transitions. Now, I want to share the last consideration, which is about safety. And this is a question that comes immediately when the nuclear is put in the equations of a low carbon scenario. I guess you all came across this press headline or similar one because this has been all over the media. Basically, burning fossil fuel has caused the death of 8.7 million globally in 2018. Of course, this didn't happen only in 2018, but also in 2017, 2016, and all the year before. So this is a huge amount of death that we have just completely ignored, probably because of all the benefits we are getting from high energy consumptions. Here, I've used data from our world in data to show indeed the number of deaths expressed by terawatt of energy produced. I'm sure that if I had asked the room for the most unsafe energy, I'm pretty sure the majority would have said nuclear. And I'm sure you are surprised to see, as I was the first time, that nuclear doesn't kill more people than solar and wind. And in case you want to ask the questions, yes, the accident of Chernobyl and Fukushima have been integrated in these figures. Now, let's move to another pillar of actions. It's to invest massively in climate solutions. Basically, to reduce greenhouse emissions already in the atmosphere. So we can do that by reducing the emission due to land use and land use changes, by capturing and storing CO2 already in the atmosphere, and by improving the resilience of ecosystem. So the potential for removing carbon from the atmosphere is huge. However, today, 8.1 tons of gigaton are emitted due to deforestation. And most of these deforestation is coming from tropical forest. You can add to that 3.5 gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions. So basically, by restoring nature and working on trying to improve and protect ecosystem, there's a huge potential to store and to reduce the emissions of the gas that we have already in the atmosphere. Now, Griscon and all have estimated the potential of CO2 sequestration from about 20 natural-based solutions. The first category concerns forest. And it's not a surprise when you see this number why there are today so many governments and companies that want to plant trees. Because indeed, this is what can provide the biggest amount of extraction from the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. The second category concerns solution linked to agriculture, with a potential about 4.8 gigaton, better grazing, use of biochar, and putting trees in cropland. And then the last category concerns wetland and coastal, with here a total gain of 2.7 gigaton. Put all together, they can deliver a third of the emission reduction that we need. But it's important to do that on top of the ability to store carbon, all these solutions provide essential added benefit. They help to preserve and restore biodiversity, to provide food, to increase resilience, to regulate water cycle, and many more. So natural-based solution should not be seen only as a solution for greenhouse gas emission, but for also restoring all the essential services that nature has been providing to us. Now, natural climate solutions have often bad press in the media and with the public at large, because they are seen as a way for countries and companies to claim to be net zero by 2050 by offsetting their emissions instead of phasing out the fossil fuel. That may be the case in a number of situations. Nevertheless, NBS are needed to achieve net zero by 2050. And let me try to explain how. And this graph is trying to illustrate that. Basically, you see the curve going down, and this is what the path that we need to take. And SCS need to be used at the same time that you decarbonize. So the absolute emissions, of course, need to be close to zero by 2050. So basically, at that time, you will offset all the residual emissions. But investing in carbon offsetting now has a lot of benefit because you actually remove this carbon from the atmosphere. So provided, of course, that when we implement this solution, this is done correctly, there is a high benefit to do it. Now, if we look at today's situations, we have seen that planting trees could deliver about 10 gigatons of emission reductions. This is more or less equivalent of what today forests are already doing. Every year, they provide a net storage of 7.6 gigatons of CO2. But as you have seen before, about 8.1 gigatons of CO2 are emitted due to deforestation. So if planting trees makes sense to compensate for the deforestations, we have to remember that 1 hectare of tropical forest does not provide the same benefit of 1 hectare of planted trees. Tropical forests have a huge carbon storage capacity and are replaced very often by monoculture of tree, usually fast-growing trees that do not have the same long-term capacity to store carbon. And then, if planting a tree is great, they need to grow to deliver the expected benefits, and that will only happen in 40 years from now. They need to grow and stay forever to become a real thing, so you don't want to cut them later on. We also need to find space for this tree. And if you remember, we also need space for renewable energy, for building cities, to produce more food, and to protect biodiversity. So there are many more considerations to take into account to ensure that planting a tree will deliver the expected benefit. For example, planting a tree in the wrong place can actually have the opposite effect, release more carbon emissions. But I don't have the time to go over that. Now, based on this data, one could conclude that the best way to use tree capability to store carbon is to stop deforestation. Well, this is where the big win is. For the carbon, for the biodiversity, and for the local people. To put things in perspective, the size of the total carbon voluntary market is today about 0.2 gigaton, so a small proportion of what nature can do if we protect it. Of course, voluntary market is expected to grow and should grow, but the best immediate win is to stop deforestation. Now, let's quickly look at the fourth pillar. Basically, the fourth pillar is about what we can do, you and me. So we are often invited to do a number of things, like changing the diet, like reducing eating and cooling, or reducing traveling. But here I want to give some idea or perspective on how much really we can do, each of us. A French agency called Carbon 4, working on this topic for many, many years, has done very interesting calculations. And basically starting with a carbon footprint about 10 tons per year, per capita for an individual in Europe, more or less, you can get 25% less, reduce your carbon footprint by 25% if you become totally vegetarians, you don't take the plane anymore, and you use your back as much as possible. Then you can get 20% more by insulating your house, by putting a low carbon heating system in your house, and by driving, for example, an electrical car. And then all the rest, if you want to go to 2 tons per year, which is a level in line with the Paris Agreement, this will have to be done by institutions, by company, by government. Basically, there is a number of things here, 55% of the actions that are not in your hands. Now, this value here, and Carbon 4 is saying that very clearly, are really in the situation of people being very active, extremely engaged. So people that really change their life. But basically, they estimate that in reality, it will be only 20% of what you can do. So let's not think that small things that we can do is going to change the planet. We really need to have breakthrough taking place at government and company level. Now, if we look at the carbon emissions in the food sector, and this data are indeed coming from Pour and Nemesek in 2019, you can see the life cycle of different food. And CO2 emissions from plant-based are about 10 to 15 times lower than animal-based products. And that's why becoming vegetarians is indeed part of the solutions. Now, what is interesting to see here is that factors like transport, retail, packaging are often very small compared to the food type that you eat. So they are hardly visible on the chart. Of course, this doesn't mean that you do not need to ban or to phase out unnecessary packaging or food transportation should be minimized. But if you really want to have an impact, you should be focusing on the type of food that you eat. Okay, so it's time now to conclude. I've been talking for about 38 minutes. I started this work on this presentation. I put together hundreds of slides that I wanted to share with you. This subject is fascinating, but also very complex. And if time would have permitted, I would have added a fifth pillar on policy and regulatory. This is, of course, a very critical pillar to get us moving ahead. For example, fixing a carbon price high enough will be probably one of the solutions to get all the economy delivering against net zero by 2050. While addressing one of these most challenging issues that humanity is facing, it's absolutely crucial that we start looking at all the solutions in a holistic and systematic way, acknowledging the fact that we live in a world of conflicting needs. And that's what I wanted to illustrate on this slide. We need to increase the food production, so more land and more energy. We need to increase, there will be an increase in demand of energy with 800 million of people do not have access to electricity. More forest, more natural space, but also we need to increase the space for building, and we need more natural resources. So there are a number of factors that are going or pulling things in different directions. So all these aspects must be taken into account simultaneously. We also must ensure that this fourth grand energy transition is fair and inclusive, not leaving part of the world population behind, helping us to become green while they are still living in poverty and very unsafe environments. And not also by creating environmental crisis somewhere else in the planet to help us drive a carbon-free emitting car. So I want to go with a few takeaways from these presentations. Basically, we already have a number of solutions, but more importantly, more innovation are needed. For example, we need innovations in battery, we need innovation in CCUS. End-of-the-pipe solution exists, as I say, but we need to improve that. We must look at all the low-carbon energy solutions. So we need to move away from only talking about renewable energy. We need to talk about low-carbon solution. Otherwise, there will not be an end to this story. We must take a life-thinking approach. So basically taking all the aspects. So when you see, solutions is great to deliver carbon reductions, well, maybe somewhere else you may have an impact that we are going to suffer about it later. And then we need to invest full speed in natural climate solutions, not only to offset, but because we need to restore nature. And we need to take a fact-based approach. So we need to move away from dogma and personal belief. We need to go back to science. To address the need for better decision-making and designing these new grand energy transitions, I think we need a new approach in research, which already exists today, but need to be expanded, generalized. We need to look at all the issues and solutions in a nexus approach, connecting all the dots to ensure that one action here is not going to have disastrous impact here. For that, we have today all the data that we need. For researchers, this is a very exciting time. I wish I could start all over again. There are today billions of data on everything that we are doing that are waiting to be connected to each other. And because our brain has limited analytical capability, we have now the algorithm and the artificial intelligence to help us interpret the interconnections and interdependence of all these informations. So I hope I gave you the envy to go further, to do your own research, because we all need to feel concerned by this issue and ensure that we are taking the right decisions. Not for us, but for the generation to come. Thank you very much.